next 15 minutes or so, we are going to talk about the Windrush generation. The story, which broke in 2018, was back in the news again this week when the UK Home Office was forced by a judge to release a report on the origins of the scandal. They refused to release it for 3 years. The report concluded that its roots lay in 30 years of what it called racist immigration legislation designed to reduce the UK's non-white population. The report itself was leaked to the Guardian newspaper back in 2022. We've been speaking to its journalist, Amelia, who has won awards for her reporting of the Windrush scandal. She was joined by Pastor Clive Foster, Senior Minister of the Pilgrim Church in Nottingham and Vice Chairperson of the Windrush National Organisation. First, Amelia, on the background to the scandal.
The Windrush scandal was something that began to emerge in 2017 through a number of interviews that we ran in The Guardian, where it became clear that a large number of people who were living in the UK entirely legally had been wrongly classified by the Home Office as illegal immigrants. These people were people who'd come to the UK as children to live from Commonwealth countries. A lot of them came from the Caribbean in the 1950s and in the 1960s. And after about half a century of living in the UK entirely legally, they began to get letters from the Home Office saying, your immigration status is unclear. And as a result of it, some people were sacked from their jobs, other people lost their homes, a lot of people were denied pensions and NHS healthcare. And in some extreme cases, we know that around 100 people, over 100 people, were wrongly arrested, detained and deported back to countries that they'd left decades before.
And Amelia, why did this happen? Did the Home Office not have proper records showing who was there legally?
The reasons for it are complex and they go back probably over 70 years. But in summary, there were two things that happened in parallel. I think, firstly, there was a tightening of immigration legislation throughout the second half of the 20th century that made it more and more complex for people who were coming from former countries of the British Empire to the UK. There had been previously more or less a kind of principle of free movement between countries of empire and England and the UK, but it became very, very restricted. It's true that the Home Office didn't keep good records of who had come in the period when people were allowed to come, which was broadly up until 1971. But all of that would have been fine, more or less, if we hadn't seen the implementation of a policy from 2012 onwards under the Conservatives, the coalition government, when Theresa May was Home Secretary. And this was the hostile environment policy. In summary, that was designed to make life more or less impossible for people who'd come to Britain who couldn't prove that they had the right to be here. So we went from quite a kind of light-touch regime in terms of checking people's paperwork to becoming a much more papers-please system, so that immigration checks essentially were brought in from something that happened at the airport or at the seaport to something that happened every time you got a new job, every time you wanted to rent a property, every time you went to see your doctor. And that new process of the hostile environment began to cause a lot of problems for people of the Windrush generation who were here entirely legally, but who didn't have the paperwork to prove it.
Clive Foster. Clive, you're very welcome to the programme. Were any of your family affected by this?
I did have a brother who couldn't prove his lawful right to be in the country, and we had to support him in getting the documentation and paperwork, and he was able to do that through the subsequent Windrush scheme that enabled to demonstrate your lawful right to be in the country and getting the documentation around indefinite leave to remain. But more so, I have been involved in working with local communities in Nottingham and across the country, subsequently on the breaking of the Windrush scandal, to support people get their documentation and their compensation. And we've been doing this since the scandal broke, and we continue to do this, working locally in Nottingham and working as part of the Windrush National Organisation. It's really sad to say, as someone who is a descendant of the Windrush generation, it really is heart-wrenching when you see people who could be my mother and father's age, who were coming in the later years, having given the best of their life to the country through work and wanting to make Great Britain great, coming with fear and trepidation, thinking that they may be, as it were, deported out of the country or denied access to certain rights. So this is still ongoing. It's really important to state that. And there are still many people who need to come forward, and there's still a need for people to be supported through this process.
And when you say it's still ongoing, are you talking about their compensation still hasn't been paid?
That's correct. Unfortunately, we are still seeing issues whereby compensation is very slow in coming forward in terms of the decision-making process. Just recently, for example, I was working on a case where somebody had started this case. I think it was nearly going on 3 years ago. And they finally, having gone through a number of reviews, like a tier review and a second review, they've finally given compensation. I have to say that I've been working along with colleagues to get the Home Office to recognise the trauma and the hurt that this is causing, because I think it's been said that one of the problems we're now faced with is that going through the compensation process itself can be so arduous for people that they are reluctant to get involved. So yes, people are still seeking redress with their status and with compensation. And we're still finding that we have to support people in achieving that outcome.
Amelia, let's come right up to this week then. What happened with this Home Office report? What was that report, first of all?
It's an incredibly powerful summary of the history of British immigration policy from the Second World War up to the end of the 20th century. It was commissioned, this history was commissioned by the Home Office in the wake of the scandal, because one of the findings given to the Home Office was that the reason why the scandal had been allowed to happen was because civil servants and ministers had a very poor understanding of Britain's colonial history and its history of empire. So although this is kind of one of the most important events of the 20th century, ministers and civil servants didn't really have a very clear grip of what had happened. So a history was commissioned. It was designed for civil servants to read, to educate themselves about what the legislation was in the 20th century and what the impact of that legislation was on people who were trying to move from former countries of the British Empire to live in the UK. The analysis that was written by this Home Office commissioned historian, I think, turned out to be a lot more hard-hitting than perhaps the people who commissioned it ever expected. It's incredibly strongly worded. It says that the British Empire depended on racist ideology in order to function. It concludes that the origins of the deep-rooted racism of the Windrush scandal lie in the fact that during the period between 1950 and 1981, every single piece of immigration or citizenship legislation was designed, at least in part, to reduce the number of people with black or brown skin who were permitted to come and work in the UK. And finally, it found that the major immigration legislation in 1962, 1968 and 1971 was designed to reduce the proportion of people living in the United Kingdom who did not have white skin. So it's a very, very hard-hitting report. And I think when the civil servants read it, they were not keen to allow it to be distributed further.
And we'll get into the reasons for that in a moment. But Clive, could I get your reaction to what was contained in that report, the conclusions that it reached?
Well, it does show us that the history of racism, discrimination, has been part of the empire, and that these immigration controls were born out of that. And it was, as was said in the report, it's quite clearly laid out, you know, from the Constable of Dover through to the breaking of the Windrush scandal and so forth. So I think it's important that civil servants and the country, the Home Office itself, can feel and comfortable and understand the importance of the history of racism and immigration policy. And if that is not there, then I think we're always going to be landing on uncertain ground, which I have to say plays out on the ground in some of these delayed decisions and a lack of empathy. Very interestingly, this particular report was obviously commissioned on the basis of the Wendy Williams review and recommendation 6. And her report, which is another outstanding report about the Windrush scandal, talks about how the Windrush scandal was actually foreseeable and avoidable. And unfortunately, as well, within that report, it talks about the defensiveness of the Home Office. And I think we've just got to this point where this particular report was available since, I believe, 2022, only coming out now. So I think the culture needs to change, but the culture has to face up to the reality of racism as explained in that report over the centuries.
Amelia, what reasons did the Home Office give for refusing to release it for so long?
Well, they had a number of justifications. They said that if the report was made public, it might reduce the trust of communities affected in the Home Office decision-making. They said it might make it hard for the Home Office to have fair and frank and open discussions about future development of its immigration policy. And they said it would make it hard for civil servants within the Home Office to have a safe space within which they can talk about immigration policy. I think it's fair to say that the tribunal judge who has this month ordered that the report be made public didn't have much sympathy with those arguments, and he said it was highly improbable that a wider dissemination of the study would make it hard for civil servants to develop new immigration policy. I mean, it's also important to say that a lot of what was in this report isn't news. I mean, we know that that's what the immigration policy of the second half of the 20th century did. Any historian of that period would tell you that. So the extreme defensiveness of the Home Office officials in trying to bury something that was in fact pretty much common knowledge is really, really remarkable.
Clive, the report has been published now. It was published on Thursday. What do you hope will happen as a result of its publication? What difference do you think it will make?
Well, first of all, I think we start to have a bigger conversation about racism and immigration in this country. And we need to recognise the importance of history, the importance of why people came to the UK, why they were part of the British Empire. And so I think that's very important. What can come out of this? Well, again, the report is based on a recommendation that the Home Office can better understand the nature and culture of immigration as it results to black and brown people and ethnic minorities. And so that the decisions that people are making with regards to any particular cases can be that context of the history can be factored into. So I think a greater understanding and respect of the history of immigration as it pertains to race equality, I think is something that not only Home Office officials, but wider government departments as well should be taking heed to.
A final word from you on that, Amelia. Do you think that's likely in the current climate, given the level of hostility in Britain and across Europe towards immigration at the moment?
Well, we've had a series of promises from successive Home Secretaries since 2018, when the government first apologised for the Windrush scandal. I think Priti Patel promised a comprehensive transformation of the Home Office to make it a fairer and more compassionate department, and made a number of commitments to bring about that wholesale cultural change. I think anybody who's had much contact with the Home Office and immigration department of the Home Office would probably say that transformation hasn't yet happened. And we've heard this week at the Labour Party conference the new Prime Minister making some fairly robust comments about the need to bring down levels of immigration. So I think it's a conversation that is going to continue to be incredibly relevant.
Amelia Gentleman of the Guardian newspaper and Pastor Clive Foster, Vice Chairperson of the Windrush National Organisation. It's 9:30.
It could be a brilliant bungalow.
I want to get to know this homeowner.
A contemporary cottage.